So for the rest of the semester, we're going to really talk more about fire management, how fire ecology can fit into fire management in particular, and particularly trying to get fire back into ecosystems that are adapted or dependent even on fire. Just one quick note, this is, you can always tell a prescribed fire from a wildfire because notice that the flames are actually leaning over into the black. You light the fire so that the flames are pushed into already burned fuel so that you have some control over the fire. And you can see the firefighter in the background there. In this lecture, I want to start with talking about, and I've mentioned this a few times, but this idea of historical ranges of variability. And again, in terms of the fire regime or fire history, these are the idea that in many ecosystems, we humans have been messing around in the ecosystems and changing them to uncharacteristic fire behavior or uncharacteristic composition or structure or whatever. So this idea is that these ecological conditions and the spatial and temporal variation in these conditions, again, keep in mind it is a range of variability. There was relatively unaffected by people. Obviously, Native Americans, indigenous peoples all over the world have had some impact, but not the ubiquitous and far-reaching impacts that industrialized society have had. So anyway, just keep this. The HRV is a big concept that's being used in quite a bit of restoration, ecological restoration, and forest management, fire management in many ecosystems, particularly in North America. One of my favorite quotes, you've seen this one before. Again, the idea is that certainly change is the only constant in ecosystems and ecology. However, there are limits to that change. And so the idea with this HRV is to be able to help define those changes a little bit more carefully. First, some definitions just in terms of one thing you'll see quite a bit in some publications it was this idea of range of natural variation. So again, the idea is that it is some sort of a range, but the implication is that humans were kind of out of the picture in most cases. Nowadays, this idea of the historical range of variability, so that this character of these patterns and processes in the past, we try and understand that character regardless of whether it's human or natural forcing of that, what process. So again, explicitly trying to incorporate indigenous use and in some cases active management of ecosystems. But again, notice that range is in there, variability is in there. So it's not just static conditions, but how those conditions played out within some sort of historical period. Just a few more definitions as well. A lot of times people confuse historic and historical. Basically, historic is something that is known. It's an actual dated event, certainly an important or well-known event. Whereas if we're talking historical processes or historical events, and we're really just characterizing that, it's not so much that we're pinning down any type of a single event or anything like that. So historical fire regime versus, say, historic fires. Paleo then is just another term that's used, just means old in Greek, so you'll hear the term paleoecology. I'll throw that around, paleoclimatology. I'd like to point out too that historical data really serve two purposes in terms of particularly forest management today, but more basic ecology as well. First of all is that, understanding longer term patterns in ecosystem processes, disturbance processes, not just fire, is pretty valuable data for just understanding basic ecology. So that second point down there, most ecological studies are really conducted over fairly short time scales, years, maybe 10 years, is a long time period for having some ecological data sets. So with the historical data, we can really kind of bring some of those processes further into the past or on broader landscape scales or regional scales even. And then the top point there is that, again, these, in terms of what we'll talk about, particularly for the rest of the semester, is that these past conditions and processes, patterns really provide some sort of context and guidance for how we want to manage into the future. So these are some of the questions that we could ask. What was the range of variation in fire regimes and forest conditions and so on? I like those two quotes down at the bottom. I think I've shown you that Mark Twain one before. But then also I really like that Davy quote, where time is required for an experiment, there's no substitute for history. So again, kind of coming back to sort of basic understanding of ecological processes, longer term processes that we may, extend beyond the range of even a human lifetime. I've thrown this figure out just in terms of how I kind of envision this. We have, these historical conditions which we can reconstruct from various bits and pieces of evidence. I'll go through methods for reconstructing historical ranges of variability in the rest of the lecture. These can be contrasted with current conditions, obviously, that we can measure today. And then certainly we have desired conditions that we would like to get to based upon either an idea of the historical conditions or some other needs that we have, fuel management or whatever, whatever the goals or objectives are for that management of a particular piece of landscape. So we can start asking some questions. First of all, again, comparing historical and current conditions. Are the current conditions sustainable? Are they resilient? Are they, are we going to be changing the fire behavior from frequent low-intensity surface fires in the past to high-intensity crown fires in the present, which means that we may be losing forested ecosystems or changing forested ecosystems into other grassland or shrubland. We can also ask, in terms of using historical data, how do we get from current conditions to desired conditions? Particularly, again, thinking about better understanding of process, how process affects pattern. What are the processes that may be missing or changed in current conditions? How do we need to then tweak those or modify those or maintain those in some cases into getting to desired conditions? Now, one other final thing I'd like to point out here is that obviously in terms of this idea of historical range of variability and management implications or management planning, we are dealing with a lot of certainly constraints. Big one, of course, for example, social constraint with prescribed fire is smoke management. We are and WUI issues, the wildland-urban interface. That certainly we can't reintroduce fire everywhere that it used to burn on the frequencies and the behavior it might have in the past. So for fire is definitely one where we've got a number of constraints, but the idea is again that the historical conditions at least provide a models for where we want to perhaps go with desired conditions into the future. For the rest of the lecture, I just want to go through some examples of HRV evidence that we can use for management. And again, I've talked about these. You've read several papers on this already in terms of disturbance regimes, particularly reconstructing fire. Obviously, that's a big one for that I've been involved with in my career. But also things like community structure, species composition, tree densities, and so on. We'll read a paper or two later in the semester that in terms of where community structures have been reconstructed from particularly tree ring data. Vegetation composition, successional dynamics, so on. All of these are, some of these are more easy to get to. We have some better evidence and so on. Others are very difficult to get to. For example, we have very little evidence typically on, the historical range of variability in different wildlife species that may have been present in a particular location. We just don't have evidence to any sort of data. We do have hints, for example, in particularly written descriptions of vegetation. Lewis and Clark, for example, when they came across the country in the early 1800s, Talked about grizzly bears being out in the Great Plains, elk being out in the Great Plains. So obviously these are some extirpated species from those habitats today that we'll probably never be able to come back into those areas. A few sources for defining HRV. Certainly we've got historic data sets such as repeat photo sequences. Again, I'll go through each of these in a little bit more detail in a minute. Plot remeasurements, in some cases early forest inventories, those kinds of things. Another one that's a really good one are the General Land Office records, GLO records. These were the early surveys that were done, depending upon the location in the U.S., from eastern U.S. to western U.S. They were done beginning in the mid 1800s through the late 1800s. So if everyone knows the township and range boundaries and so on, the sections, these were measured during the GLO surveys. Interesting thing is that they did measure, they did talk about vegetation that they came across. They actually used what are called witness trees, and they measured the distance from each GLO point, each section point or quarter section point to the nearest trees. So they recorded sizes and species of those trees. And then they would record things like, if they were going through burned areas or things like that. So people have gone back through those to try and reconstruct the vegetation that was there in the past and the type of fire and extent of fire and so on. Other data sets include paleoecological data. Pollen has been, you've heard about that in that Kathy Whitlock paper from before, charcoal, etc., pack rat middens, and of course tree ring reconstructions. I'll talk about pack rat middens in just a second if you've never heard of that. That's a macrofossil method. Other things like reference areas, so for example, National Park Service areas, research natural areas, and the Forest Service, wilderness areas. However, a lot of these are one thing to keep in mind on many of these reference areas is that they have had some impact from humans. They may not have been harvested or grazed or other things like that, but in many cases, fire suppression has occurred in those areas. So that has potentially changed the species structure, composition, fire behavior, and so on. Ecological logic. So for example, the good example of that is the Noble and Slatner approach of looking at vital attributes as what sorts of species life histories and traits do individual species have that allow them to either persist or not through particular disturbance processes or disturbance events and things like that. So the Noble and Slatner paper certainly fits into this category there. And then the last category there is using some sort of simulation modeling as well. The good example of that is the land fire data sets, where they've used a whole series of what are called biophysical settings for particular areas to come up with ideas for successional dynamics, for fire behavior, for stand structures, and so on. Neat thing about land fire is that's seamless for the entire United States. So 30 by 30 meter grids. Each 30 by 30 meter grid has a BPS, this biophysical setting, which is the historical vegetation at that particular location based upon the disturbances, soils, climate, all these other components that would go into that. First method I want to mention is just written records or historic photographs. In many cases we have some pretty good records that we can draw upon. A lot of these are anecdotal, of course, so it's not very scientific in many cases, but they certainly help to really get a picture of what vegetation might have been like in the past. In the Western U.S., and many, of course, photography is only about 150 years old, or 180 years old or so. So in other cases, we do have paintings that can be useful as well, landscape paintings. Typically, we know exactly where the photograph was taken in terms of repeat photographs, so spatial resolution is pretty high. Often temporal resolution is pretty high as well, because certainly often we typically know the year the photograph was taken, quite often even the day and the month it was taken. Limited spatial coverage, particularly in the western U.S. And particularly as we go back in time, there's not that many from say, the 1860s or 70s or 80s, but as we come up into the 1890s, there's more, and so on. A lot of times they were taken to mining camps or other places like that. So certainly there's biases in exactly where the photographs were taken. And also just think about, a lot of times the photographs were taken because they were scenic. So they were looking at the area that was the prettiest, taking the photograph direction that looked good. And, maybe if they turned 180 degrees around instead of that nice open forest canopy that's in the photograph, would have been a much more closed canopy. So certainly keep those in mind as, again, these are anecdotal descriptions and evidence. Here's a sequence from Eastern Oregon, Eastern Oregon, the Malheur refuge area. And again, you can see the nice open understory. This is ponderosa pine ecosystem, fairly scattered trees, multi-aged, multi-sized. I think this photograph, I can't remember exactly when this was, but I believe it was 1890s or so. And then here's a repeat photograph today. You can still see the stems, but notice all of the trees that have grown up. The understory's changed completely, and of course, these are now ladder fuels. And so we've changed the probably fire behavior in this landscape as well. Here's a sequence from the Flagstaff area. This is in the Gus Pearson experimental forest just outside of Flagstaff in northern Arizona. 1909. There's actually been a fire history done in this stand as well, and the last fire date was in 1871. Before 1871, fires burned in this area about every 5 to 7 years on average. So this is the 1909 photograph. This area was never harvested. It was an experimental forest early on, and so they actually protected the trees at one point. It has been grazed, so notice the understory is a little bit sparse. There's not a lot of grass. Probably would have been more in the past, but particularly watch those three central trees right there. So this is the next photograph, 1949. All of that regeneration, you see, those saplings were started in 1919, most all of them. Gus Pearson himself, he was an early forester in the area, noticed this amount of regeneration that got started in 1919, just optimal climate conditions. We actually did a study several years ago on that 1919 pulse in the Flagstaff area. Now again, in the past, if the natural fire regime was burning through here, all of those seedlings, 99.9% of those seedlings would have been killed in the next fire that would have come through. But because you have fire exclusion going on after 1871, now all of those trees are able to establish and to grow, all those seedlings. Coming up more to the present, 1992, and now it's what we call the doghair thickets. You can barely see those three overstory trees in the background, the older trees, but you can see now that these are ladder fuels. Fire may start on the ground, but it can transition through the ladder fuels, the doghair stems into the overstory, and instead of low intensity surface fire, high intensity crown fire today. Here's another set of photographs from the Black Hills. This is an interesting set. Custer, George Armstrong Custer of Custer's massacre fame in 1876. In 1874, he came through the Black Hills with a column of about 100 wagons, you can see in the valley down below, and around 400 men, mostly soldiers, guides, and so on. And then also he brought a photographer along, Illingsworth. And so Illingsworth took a whole series of photographs in the Black Hills, which then these two guys, Ernest Grafe and Paul Horstedt, went back and actually found all of the spots and then retook the photographs. So here's an 1874 photograph of the Custer expedition, you can see. And notice how open the hillsides are. That's ponderosa pine, almost all ponderosa pine, probably some aspen back there in the background as well. Notice the shrubs down along the stream bed down in the bottom of the canyon. But you can see the ground underneath the trees is the big thing to take from this photograph. One other thing just to look right there is that snag. Watch that snag down there in the lower right hand of the picture. Here's the repeat photograph. First of all, the snag is still there. So 100 and whatever 30 years later, uh, there's that snag still standing. But notice the background as well in terms of that the forest is really densified, come down into the valley a lot more. You can't see the understory underneath the trees any longer. Also notice that the willows, that shrub vegetation along the stream channel down there in the bottom seems to have shrunk quite a bit. So changes in riparian communities as well. Here's just another sequence from the Illingsworth collection that Grafe and Horstedt retook. But particularly notice the hillside right there in the background. You can see the bare ground. Also, I like to, on these historic photographs, I always like to look at the ridge tops. And notice the trees up there on the ridge. You can actually see space between them. You can see underneath the canopy, sky underneath the canopy. Here's the repeat photograph. This road is, by the way, if anybody knows the Black Hills, is the road from Custer to Hill City. The Crazy Horse Monument. It's a big giant sculpture in the order of Mount Rushmore, is about 2 miles to the right of this photograph. So it's right along the highway there. Obviously, the helicopter wasn't there in 1874 either. But again, notice that you can't see the ground, and look again up at that ridge top, and you can't see sky between the trees. Also, aerial photographs. The earliest aerial photographs were taken usually in the late 1930s into the 40s, early 40s, and then of course World War II tended to disrupt quite a bit of that effort. This is from actually this is Wind Cave National Park in the Black Hills as well. But these are really nice because you can see mosaics of grassland, forest, and so on. By the way, in the middle of those two roads right there, that big blob of trees right in the middle, we've got a fire history study that we did a few years ago. And essentially in this area, the fire frequency prior to 1890 was the last fire date that we found in the last big fire date that we found in this area. Fire frequency about every 10 to 12 years. This is the prairie grassland ponderosa ecotone in the southeast corner of the Black Hills. Here's the 1938 photograph, and then here's one from 1972. See quite a bit more trees that have established after fire exclusion in this area. Also, just even more recently, you can see quite a bit of changes in forest structure. This is just a couple of sequences from 2002. Harney Peak, again, this is in the Black Hills. Most of this is lodgepole or ponderosa pine that you can see. Some lodgepole pine, but vast majority is ponderosa. There was a huge mountain pine beetle outbreak at the time, and this is what that scene looks like in 2008. So quite a lot of mortality caused by mountain pine beetle. The second method I want to discuss is using pollen analysis. Again, I'm not going to go through this fairly fast since you've had the introduction with the Kathy Whitlock paper before. Again, these are sediment data. Typically, pollen preserves its chitinous covering. Pollen is produced by the male cones and plants, male parts of the plants, and it depends upon whether it's a wind dispersed or an insect dispersed pollen. I'm not going to go through these too much, but it's a great method and it's certainly been used quite a bit. Generally, in terms of dating these events, these are dated by radiocarbon dates, C14 dates. So we get decadal to centennial resolution just because of the C14 method. Pretty much any living organism is radiocarbon dead, it's called, for over about 40,000 years ago. The radiocarbon has decayed away, so it is not useful beyond that point. Certainly in the western U.S. in particular, very limited spatial coverage because we don't have that many lakes, obviously. In other areas of the world, Europe, eastern U.S., where there is more lake sediments that people can use to take cores from, there's much greater coverage of paleo vegetation patterns. And certainly the spatial scale of the reconstructions are dependent highly on what kind of pollen we're dealing with. If it's a wind dispersed pollen, for example, pine pollen can blow all over the place, and so even very far away from forests, we still end up, pine forests, lake sediments still end up with pine pollen in them. Also, I've mentioned this before, I believe, but in the Whitlock paper, but quite often it's hard to get down to, for example, species level. These are two pine pollens right here, and all pine pollen looks more or less the same. So we can only get it down to the genus Pinus rather than to know, okay, that one on the left is ponderosa and the one on the right is lodgepole pine. It's very, very difficult to identify down to species level. Just a slight diversion here in terms of radiocarbon dating, if you're not familiar with it, but probably most of you are. I'll go through this fairly quick, but there's different isotopes of carbon. So carbon-12 is the normal carbon. All the carbon atoms have 12 protons. It depends upon the number of neutrons. So carbon-12, carbon-13, and carbon-14 are the three most common types of carbon. Carbon-12 is by far the most common. 13 is a little bit fractions of a percent of carbon. And then carbon-14 is even less common than that. The interesting thing about carbon-14, though, of course, is it's part of the CO2 molecule. It's absorbed by plants and is incorporated in through woody tissues or leaf tissues or any other vegetation that then is eaten by plants or eaten by animals or people. But anyway, it's radioactive. It decays through time to either carbon-12 or carbon-13. And as it does so on a fairly regular basis, so that by measuring the amount of carbon-14 relative to carbon-13 or 12 in the plant, then the person, the analysis can then figure out more or less, what the age of the plant was when it died, or when that carbon was incorporated into the woody material. So again, these studies of fossil pollen records depend mainly on lakes. Pollen falls in the lake and then is buried. Go out and core these. I've cored lakes before. It's kind of a hard procedure typically with just hand power typically. And then this is what one of the sediment cores looks like. And then of course, to tear that apart and find the pollen record at different depths. A couple of quick things just about, you've seen this figure before, but just these are from ice cores in Antarctica and or Greenland that people have taken and looking at CO2 actually, what the trapped air in the ice, the amount of CO2 in that is, that's the red line. And then also using other isotopic information, particularly from oxygen isotopes, to look at the temperature. And you can see the Holocene. We're in this warm Holocene period that's only lasted for about 12,000 years, and then the late glacial maximum was about 20,000 years ago, as the maximum cold, the maximum extent of the ice on northern and southern hemispheres. Just a couple of points about that. This is a pollen diagram, or pollen of oak in northern Europe. On the top there at A, you can see this is the glacial maximum of ice extent, so around probably 18 to 20,000 years ago. So big ice sheets covering most of Scandinavia, England, and then where pollen cores have been collected and where oak is either present or not. The red dot's not, and green dot's of course present. So you can see during the coldest extent of the ice ages, deciduous oaks in Europe were only present around the Mediterranean or the Iberian Peninsula. As it starts to warm up, the ice sheets start to shrink. You can see this progression of oak north. So 11,000 years ago. And then at 6,000 years ago, it's pretty much at the extent it is today. So we can see these migrations of plants in these regional analyses of pollen records. And of course, we can see, by analyzing charcoal, also looking at the fire records as well in some of these areas. Third method I want to mention, in case you've never seen this one before, it's a pretty neat little one, is this pack rat middens. Wood rats, the genus Neotoma, are pretty neat little beasties. They go out and collect all sorts of plant parts to build a nest with. If you've ever wandered around southern Arizona, southern New Mexico, you've seen pack rat midden nests. They build these for protection. A lot of times they have cactus in them and different sticks and spines and needles and all sorts of things. Seeds they'll bring into these. And then quite often they'll build them up in rocks as well. So, in cliffs, if there's a particular rock shelter, then there's another area that the midden, in addition to the nest, the pack rat is a fairly fastidious little creature and likes to go out and sweep out the nest occasionally into what's called a midden. It goes out there, and it also is where it pees. It goes out there and pees on this thing, all these plant parts and so on. And if these are in a dry environment, dry cave environment, the pee will dry out, it'll harden, indurate, and then it'll preserve all of these plant parts into this midden. So you can see one on the left there where, you got lots of needles, you got seeds, all sorts of things. Pack rats do collect all sorts of things. Quite often you'll find archaeological, arrowheads and projectile points in these things and so on. So by collecting these things, what the midden researcher can do then is put them in a bucket of water that reconstitutes the pack rat pee, strain off all the plant parts and pollen and so on like that, and then sort through them and figure out what was growing there at the time the pack rat was living there. The pack rat doesn't go more than about 50 meters from the nest. They've measured this in modern middens to collect the plants. So you know that the plants were growing within pretty close to where the midden came from. And by getting a radiocarbon date on some of the plant parts, then they can find out when that vegetation assemblage was there. So it gives a pretty good idea of what was present at different locations at different time periods. Certainly there's limited spatial coverage on these things. They're not present everywhere. And there is some bias in the representation of the species. The pack rats do have selection bias. They don't just go out and collect everything, obviously, but they particularly like things like cactus or pine needles, conifer needles in general, that they can, help protect their nest with. And again, they occasionally just sweep those out. And they'll sweep out fecal pellets as well out there onto the midden. Lots of work that's been done using middens in the Great Basin, Southern California, Southwest Arizona, New Mexico, and also in northern Mexico. This is actually an old paper from 1960 or 1998. This is a paper, but a lot of really good data that's come from this. Here's an example of using middens and tree ring data. This is Owl Canyon, a pinyon site, Pinus edulis, that's very disjunct. It's just north of Fort Collins in the Front Range of Colorado. It's very disjunct population from the nearest other pinyon. So continuous pinyon forest, Pinus edulis forest, is really is down in the Arkansas Valley, about as far north as it goes as the Garden of the Gods, just outside of Colorado Springs, if anyone's ever been down there. So this stand is quite a bit. It's about 150 kilometers north of the nearest other distribution. So you can see a couple of historic photographs. It seems to be growing, much more pinyon in this latter photograph than in the earlier photograph. And then here's this pack rat midden record from the Owl Canyon Pinyon Grove that was done a number of years ago. Over on the left, you can see the ages of the different pack rat middens. So each of these is a single midden that was then sorted, and the plants were identified in it. So you can see it had ponderosa pine. So the oldest midden is around 5,100 years ago. And again, all radiocarbon dates have a standard deviation associated with them. So that's that plus or minus 110. Just because of the radiocarbon method, it's not that accurate in terms of getting down to annual resolution or so. But you can see ponderosa was present, juniper was present. That's Rocky Mountain juniper, Juniper scapularum. Punches, prickly pear cactus, yucca. Cercocarpus is mountain mahogany. And then notice the Pinus edulis, the pinyon. It only shows up, the first instance of it is about 420 years ago. That matches pretty well the dendrochronological age of the oldest trees that we've sampled up there, around 1550. So basically there's a handful of trees that are that old that we found. Essentially what it looks like is that, perhaps one thing about pinyon seeds is they're highly nutritious and very edible, and Native Americans would collect them, and perhaps someone was collected a whole bunch down in the Arkansas Valley, wandered north, and then happened to drop them up here in the Owl Canyon area. Another possibility would be bird dispersion. Corvids, love gray jays and shrub jays, pinyon jays love pinyon, and so perhaps a pinyon jay got blown north and happened to die right up there at the Owl Canyon site. Somehow or another, though, an initial cohort of trees got established at the site. And then more recently, you can see that actually the Pinus edulis has increased in numbers, and we see that in the dendrochronology as well. So just a very interesting method, again, for reconstructing past vegetation patterns. I've wandered around myself when I was a graduate student years and years ago in Nevada looking for pack rat middens, and we got to the point where we could actually even, just by the smell of the pack rat piss, figure out exactly when if it was a Holocene or a late glacial maximum pack rat midden. So the things you learn in science. Just real quick, coming back to just this ice sheets over North America, in case you've not seen this before, but basically we had, during the late glacial maximum, two main ice sheets, one over the Rocky Mountain Cordillera, and then the other one over the northeastern North America, over the Great Lakes, over a good portion of what is today northeastern U.S. and New England. One thing is that the last warm period, the last interglacial period, was about 125,000 years ago. So these ice sheets were here for quite a long period of time. One thing is that there was so much water, and this is not just in North America, but also all across Eurasia and in South America as well, is that sea levels were actually lowered by about 300 meters, 1,000 feet or so. So all that water was bound up in ice, essentially. One interesting thing on this was that there was this land bridge, and it wasn't just a bridge, but it was about 1,000-kilometer wide area connecting Alaska and Siberia. So a lot of movement of animals back and forth, but also people. So before about 15,000 years ago, there were not people in North and South America. They came over from the Old World around that time and really expanded at that time. There was this ice-free corridor down the McKenzie River that formed by about 18,000 years ago. Also, another thing is that as the ice started melting, going into the Holocene, all of that meltwater actually then formed huge lakes, particularly in the Great Basin. So if you've ever been to the Great Salt Lake around in central Utah, notice that there are strand lines, beach lines, way up on the mountains. You'll see these horizontal lines all over the place around the basins down there. So the Pleistocene Lake Lahontan, Pleistocene Lake Bonneville, just huge lakes that filled up a number of the basins in the Great Basin. Actually, the thought is that the Columbia River Gorge was a catastrophic breach of a dam in Lake Lahontan in eastern Oregon, and that drained out in a sudden rush, and that's why it caused the huge canyon that's the Columbia River Gorge today. Um, Last few slides here, but just in terms of cooler and wetter conditions during the late glacial maximum, did depress vegetation structure. We know this again from both the pollen and particularly the pack rat midden data. So essentially, vegetation was, the distribution, because it was much cooler during the time, also drier in many cases. Again, a lot of water that was bound up in ice sheets, cooler oceans, less evaporation off of the oceans. Led to changes in vegetation distribution, ecosystem distributions. So for example, alpine tundra covered, so on the left side of the figure there, going up an elevation gradient, see that alpine tundra ecosystems covered quite a bit more area than they do today. There was a recognizable spruce fir forest, Picea and Abies, that's still recognizable today. There was also this huge mixed conifer landscape of mostly limber pine, Douglas fir, Rocky Mountain juniper, and then below that was a pinyon juniper zone, dominated more by juniper, but still had pinyon as a major component. So a PJ ecosystem that's similar, and lots of desert shrub that's still present today, artemisia, sagebrush, and lots of other shrub species that are still present. Once it warms up in the Holocene, then we come to today's distribution, where alpine tundra is fairly restricted to the tops of many of the peaks. Not that extensive an ecosystem any longer. Spruce fir again is still a recognizable ecosystem. These are about 1,000 meters higher distributions on average than they were during that late glacial ice age. The mixed conifer zone. Really interesting point, though, is that ponderosa during the Holocene replaces limber pine. Limber pine was everywhere. Today, limber pine is fairly restricted, and I've got a map to show you that distribution in a second, but ponderosa is all over the western U.S. now instead of limber. There's still this recognizable pinyon juniper woodland, and then, of course, there's still, extensive areas, much greater, of course, than in the Holocene, of this desert scrub and juniper grasslands and shrublands. Where was the ponderosa pine during the Holocene? It was basically restricted down to, you've already read the Jody Norris paper, so I'm not going to go through this again, but it was essentially restricted to northern Mexico, and just a couple of locations in what is today the United States, southern Arizona, southern New Mexico. It's a relatively recent newcomer. This is an older map that Jody had put together for where known examples of ponderosa. So her work up there in eastern Montana and Wyoming basically has those dates of when ponderosa first shows up in some of those mountain ranges. So very recent newcomer. It's still migrating north, basically, both in the Sierras and through the Central Rockies, the Rocky Mountain Cordillera. What happened to all the limber pine? Again, limber was even more widely distributed than ponderosa during the late glacial, and still widespread, has the largest elevational distribution of any tree in Colorado. It's found up at tree line sites in Rocky Mountain National Park, and is found in eastern Colorado and eastern plains, out in isolated little woodland areas. So going from grasslands to tree line, basically. But it really no longer dominates. There's a few places where it forms limber pine forest, but not that many. Typically, it's in much more isolated little pockets. Why the switch from limber to ponderosa is a big biogeographic question if anyone's looking for a thesis to address. But one thing is that limber it's thinner barked, and its squatter crowns doesn't self-prune as readily as ponderosa. So when we come into the warmer, drier, one hypothesis that's been thrown out there is we come into the warmer and drier Holocene, surface fires become more dominant. Grassland ecosystems become much more common, grassland fire regimes, and ponderosa is a much better competitor in those types of ecosystems and those types of fire regimes. So if we go back into cooler and wetter conditions at some point someday, perhaps limber will come back and ponderosa will disappear back down to Mexico. Who knows? And then finally, real briefly, I'll just mention methods to determine HRV. Of course, dendroecology, we've been through this, fire scars, etc. So we have typically seasonal and annual resolution, certainly in many areas of the world, widespread spatial coverage, but of course limited to forested ecosystems. And there's biases in the types of fire regime data, as we've already discussed. You guys had a great set of discussions on that already. What data can we use? Certainly the fire scars. Again, I'm not going to go through all these. That cat face behind that in the photograph there has 13 fire scars. I'll let you see if you can count all those. Those are the little ridges right there. Again, that's what they look like. Tree recruitment dates, of course, we talked about that. So if we're dealing with a lodgepole pine forest or other forest that has, say, serotinous cones or blown in seeds or something, those will all post-date the last fire. Of course, note that there's also climate forcing of regeneration dynamics as well, recruitment. Tree death dates. Of course, trees are killed by fire as well, but don't forget that they're killed by other factors. And then it's also limited because of sapwood decay. So, for example, in the cross-section on the left there, you can see the tree died in 1916 up there at the very top, but most of the sapwood is decayed away. Most of that you're looking at is heartwood. I've mentioned that before in the videos as well. We know what this tree died of. It died of bark beetles because there's actually blue stain in the sapwood. Oh, and I forgot to mention on tree recruitment dates, there is very much a limitation on actually finding the actual germination date of a tree. It's pretty much a destructive process. I mean, for increment cores, we tend to core right at the base of the tree to get as close to germination as we can. But obviously there's even we're coring 10 centimeters up from the base of the tree. It still took the tree some time to grow from germination to that 10 centimeters height. Very, very few studies have actually tried to reconstruct the actual date of germination of an individual tree. And then finally here, just tree growth responses. Neighbors die. That provides less competition to surviving trees, so you'll have a growth increase. Growth suppression sometimes, for example, if the crown gets scorched, the tree still lives through the fire, but the crown gets badly scorched, then we'll have a decrease in growth for some number of years after that fire. So all sorts of different components, physiological responses that the tree may have to disturbances, not just fire. And then final slide here, I just wanted to mention is, I've mentioned this before, but we can actually even tell, particularly with the fire scars, where in the ring the fire occurred, and by that have some idea, knowing more or less when the ring starts up in the springtime, ceases growth in the early fall, more or less when that fire might have occurred in the year, during the year. So in the top you see one that was in the late early wood. We divide the early wood up into thirds, so early wood, middle early wood, or late early wood. One that's in late wood itself, so this is probably around August, late August, early September. And then the last photograph down there is what's called a dormant season fire, where the fire occurred after growth ended for the previous year, but before growth began for the later year. So this could have been an early fall fire or an early spring fire of the next year. In this case, we really need to know something about sort of the dominant fire seasons of the particular area we're dealing with to know, does it date to the last year or to the next year as to exactly where to date that one. So thank you very much.